Thank you and welcome. You may have already picked up I'm not Carrie Ann. My name is John Smithies. I'm the Director of the Cultural Development Network in Melbourne. Our first meeting was in Canberra. We had 5 agenda items came out of that. It was critical that we were all there except for the City of Darwin. They came in on video conference, and there was a real sense that there's a national role that local government plays in arts development. And out of those, and at the same time, the Commonwealth Government and the states have signed an arts and culture accord with ALGA, and they're working on a work plan for that. And that's going to be a framework for how the states, the Commonwealth and local government works in the arts across the nation. This forum will be a way of looping back into that policy discussion. We're also looking at the measures of local government. We know local government spends $1.3 billion in arts, culture and heritage spending each year. It's about 19% of the national spend. It's growing faster than the state and Commonwealth. We also know that that doesn't really represent what communities and what councils put into this work. So it's a pretty significant area. If you divvy it up amongst the 565 councils, it's about 2.3 million per council. How many councils here have spending 2.3 million in arts and culture? Probably not many. So why is it uneven like that is one of the questions. So that's part of the context for this. And what we're going to talk about today is around council-led arts projects. CDN is not a producer, it doesn't make art. We work as an exec producer. We'll bring the teams and the resources around to support councils, so that over time councils become exec producers in their own right. Not to be the artists, not to be the producers, but to know how to make things happen. Typically in the projects we've worked on, and the work today we're going to talk about represents about 11 projects we've done, they've all had some mention and support from a council plan. And essentially, arts projects that don't have any hook or don't see themselves in council plans are very hard to get off the ground. Secondly, they're multi-year and have some expectation of sustainable development that's going to go beyond. So it's not a short-term project. Thirdly, we use professional artists, as you might contract engineers, other services. We contract artists who are professional in the field. And fortunately, there's a growing number of artists who have developed these skills now in Australia for some 20, 30 years. And some of the new courses from universities and art schools are giving us more artists to work with as well. Public outcomes is a given, and that it engages diverse communities. So what we've learnt over this time of doing 11 projects over 7 years, these are the common forms to it, but we do have some particular dynamics we're going to talk through today. At this point I'll introduce the panel, and I'll introduce them in more detail later. We have Darren, second from the end, from Gold Coast. Councillor Judy Peters next to him. Rod Ainsworth, you all know, he's got a bit of spare time today to sit in on this. Thalep Ahmad from Rockhampton from the Health Service. And Sue McLennan from Charters Towers. And Sue was my first contact for this panel because we worked together in Charters Towers on one of the projects we'll talk about today. But I've got to thank Susan King and Angela Redshaw and Rod, in fact, for helping me find the other rabble of the panel. They all come highly recommended. I know we won't have any trouble getting them to talk. The tricky bit will be to keep them contained, and I'll try and do the best I can on that. So let's talk about these 5 dynamics which we've raised so far. They're in a particular order for a particular reason. For CDN, our first contact in the council is the arts manager, and Sue's going to talk a bit about that role later on. And the arts manager, because we service that constituency, is where our conversations usually start. A lot of our projects start there, or can start with the CEO. We don't set out to go into a council and say, let's do something. I do a lot of travel around the state and now across the country. I meet with different people from councils, and more or less things start to develop. A project we just started this year in Maryborough in Victoria started with a conversation with the gallery manager back in 2010, early 2010. So it does take time for things to develop. The arts manager in council has 2 very important relationships to manage. One of those is with the artists, whether they're contracted on the project, whether they live in the community. There's often a divide between the understanding of what artists do and what councils do. A good manager is going to be able to communicate that well to artists in all sort of levels. The second critical one for that arts manager is going to be that relationship to who pays the cheque, who writes the cheque, the CEO, the executive. Now essentially, as we go around this table in an anti-clockwise way, we're going to talk about these relationships. Although everybody talks to everyone, critically we've seen in our observation with these projects that when these particular relationships work well, the projects have excellent outcomes. Moving around the table, we're going to get Darren to talk about that CEO executive level. Darren's the Director of Major Projects and Economic Development at the Gold Coast City Council. He's got particular challenges and projects ahead, but he's also going to give a perspective of how the executive works between the management side and that responsibility to council. The next set of relationships is going to come with councillors, and Councillor Judy from Bundaberg is going to talk to that. And this is an important relationship, again, often misunderstood, can often be got wrong by councillors or execs. But this positioning between the community leaders, and essentially councillors come out of that pool and go back to that pool, and the governance role is very different to being a community leader outside of council. The governance role, setting the objectives, setting the framework that a CEO can say, yes, our response to that framework will be this project. And then the next one, which Thalep's going to represent, is the community leaders. Apart from his own experience in state government and assisting communities, Thalep is a self-professed non-artist, but he has worked a lot with artists and other community leaders. So he'll talk a bit about that relationship between councillors, community leadership, and on the other side, those artists within the community and the artists that may be on the project. Brings us back round then to Rod and his relationships between the council manager and again the community. So there's a reason why they go in that form. You could, in some way, want to move relationships across here, but our experience is once you start to mess up the fundamentals, you get into really messy areas. The other thing that we've learnt over the time is that when you do lose one of those sections, or one of them's not quite as strong as the other, or one dominates, the project can become unbalanced. We've had experiences where we've actually lost CEOs partway through a project, which has been really devastating for the project because the CEO was a leader of that project, but there wasn't enough around that CEO when they left to support the project. We've had projects where we've actually lost councillors. One example was in Charters Towers and Dalrympleshire merger in 2008-9. We lost them. Another council we worked with went into administration shortly after we started the project. So we're then dealing with no councillors, an administrator and a general manager. So we're already 2/3 out of that wheel of 5. We've lost artists on projects. Sometimes the wrong artist is contracted or employed, and there's got to be a changeover. We've certainly lost council managers over a period of time. Fortunately, Sue was stable all the way through with our project in Charters Towers. But we've lost nearly all parts of that. You never lose committee leaders, but sometimes they're never engaged to start with. And of the 11 projects we've had, some of the projects not get that community leadership involved, and the project has fallen over or dropped off in the end. We know for a fact that when other parts do change, particularly CEOs and councillors, it's the community leadership that provides the stability and the memory of that community of what went on before. I'm not going to talk about the projects that only just made it or made it well but not quite, because I think it would be unfair to those projects. But I will at the end come back to one of the case studies, one council that got all of those 5 things right from the beginning, and I'll talk through how that worked over time. But my plan now is I'm going to start to work through this table with our panel and ask, first of all, Sue to talk a little bit about her experience of how this dynamic works in her own projects, a bit about her relationships with artists and the council executive. And then we'll work our way around the table to Darren. So Sue, do you want to kick off with a bit of experience and even a bit of challenge to the theory and to that set of dynamics? And you might need to move close to the microphone.
Yeah. Can I just explain a little bit about our project?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Dawn came with a conversation about animating democracy was the language of the time. And it was about how do we get a council and a community understanding both their needs and working collaboratively across. It was about how does a council develop new tools, creative tools, to do that, to animate democracy, to excite democracy, to engage in it at the highest level of participatory or whatever level you wanted to, but it's about how do we get that excited, that animation. So our project was called Connecting Through 3 Generations of Time, which focused on the connections between 3 generations of Indigenous and pastoralists, using creative art as a platform for building relationships and establishing common ground. Yesterday I learned about the words relatedness and relationality, and that's what we did. I didn't understand that, and my Bidgerdii people who took me through that process didn't actually use that language, but they certainly did speak in the same way. It was an interesting conversation because it was a council, once we got it going, it was a council initiated, but it was a very high participatory conversation, led by the community, but under council process and protocol. The relationship had to start for us at the time with the CEO and myself and CDN at the time, talking about what were we doing. It was a huge contribution for 3 years from our council, probably the largest contribution in any arts-led community project in our history. It was over $300,000 and council was a significant player in that. So the communication with the CEO initially, it still had to go through due process, but the communication with the CEO initially was critical. And having that been seen as to what the philosophies, the planning, your structures, your operational and corporate, your community plans, those community plans that exist, but your corporate plans, had the same principles and philosophies of what this was going to align with, and were they relevant. So it really was having access, and often different structures in local government may not always, its pathways to getting to people is really critical, I feel.
It's fair to say at that stage you hadn't identified artists on the project, you were still having an internal council discussion.
We hadn't identified artists at this stage, so I'll talk about how we got to the artists, but we hadn't identified artists. It was, well, this was the concept, this was the, can we go forward? Because then it had to go to council and it had to be approved, of course, all due process. But it was about very much engaging with that CEO at the time. And the CEO came on board philosophically, and I suppose most of my work throughout my community development work for the last 30 years has been around a belief that if I get the philosophy right with the people that I'm working with and want to work with me, then that's the under the iceberg conversation. We've agreed to the similar values and core principles of what we want to achieve. Then we nut out what's above, the iceberg floating above. That's the bit you normally just see. And that's where a lot of people, I feel, we get caught in. Let's go back to our shared commonality and shared values. And in this case, they align with our council.
And that's the CEO took that to council. And
then the CEO took that to council, yep. And took that through, and it was adopted. So that was that process.
Yep.
The artist relationship, once that was adopted by council, it became a conversation working with pastoralists and Indigenous. So it was a very quiet conversation for our community in some ways too. It wasn't meant to be a festival or a fair or street parades, and it could have been that, but they chose not to because they determined and they designed, which was the challenge also, because often councils will go in and go, as I said before, it's council initiated, but it was community led.
So that relationship with the leaders came very early?
The leaders, probably within the Indigenous, the leaders had to come out very early because they were the ones, we had to work through all the Indigenous cultural protocols, and I had to take that on board, and council had to take that on board as a client, as a ratepayer, as an artist, as a community leader, as a sector of their community. We had protocols we had to adopt in this particular case. So once the community leaders within the Indigenous culture were around us, we were then directed across to the artists that we wanted to work on, and vice versa for the rural. So we had to get into our rural community in the same way. There's a massive report that you can read on Community Cultural Development Network, which RMIT followed us for 3 years. And it's a phenomenal report. I actually read a bit more this morning and went, wow. There's learnings in that. Did we get it right all the way through? Absolutely not. Did we create excellence in some very small ways? Absolutely yes at the end.
And I think for that project it wasn't about starting out to create an art project. There was a council issue that was known to the CEO, the community leadership, etc. But the cultural path or dimension was chosen through the work you had done.
Yes, it was. We didn't choose to create local festivals or sculptures. We actually just wanted to use the arts as a tool. And I suppose that's where our discussions constantly went back to council, is how to, I wouldn't mind coming back to the mapping conversation with Carol's later on, but we wanted the arts as a tool, as a conduit to have conversations. So for us, we had to paddock. We were never going to solve the native title issues at a local level, so we decided not to do those. We decided that we were going to have shared values. So it was about community, it was about the environment, but the country, on country, and it was about the future. So all our artistic activities, which were many and varied, we still have some running and some still connected, and there are physical outcomes as well. There are productions of art. Were based around those 3 topics, and we never deviated. We paddocked everything else. We couldn't go into a political realm. So it was a medium for us to move through, very different to the other projects in this 5. We were on 5.
Right. And I might point out that even though we won't have time to get to it, the art output from this project was of excellence. It stood in its own feet. It got exhibited in Melbourne. The work that came out was fantastic over the 3 years, so there was no intention on a particular artwork. It came out of the process. I'm going to throw to Darren, talk a little bit about that relationship between the council plan, finding that issue which was in Charters Towers one, based around the relationships between traditional owners and pastoralists, and intersecting with the manager. Some of the experience, say, from Gold Coast, and particularly you've got a big challenge ahead with the Commonwealth Games and what follows.
And I suppose the interesting discussion we've had so far has brought out a couple of really key words around alignment and relevance and relationships. And those, along with those roles, is the relationship between the roles, which is really important if you want to be successful in any of these projects. And from a council executive perspective, those relationships depend on the extent of mutual benefit between those groups. There has to be mutual benefit. It can't be a one-way street. And from an executive perspective, you're recommending to council. Your job is to recommend to the ultimate decision makers, the local government members, the councillors, and you've got to be able to pass those public benefit tests for the expenditure of public money. And so the way you do that is characterising these things not as costs. The investment in art and culture shouldn't be characterised really as a cost. It should be characterised as an investment. The Gold Coast is no different to other regional centres where the economy is reliant on a relatively dominant industry. On the Gold Coast, it happens to be tourism. In mining centres, it's mining. In agricultural centres, it's agriculture. That not everyone has a industry base as diversified as a capital city in a regional context. And so we are relying on trying to rapidly diversify our economy. So we don't happen not to have a coal mine in the Gold Coast, and so are relying on other knowledge-based type industries. And so to have a knowledge-based industry, you need to have a lot of innovation in your city, and if you want to have innovation, you have to have a lot of creative people. And so hence the idea of cultural projects as a transformation, as an investment, not a cost. If you can characterise it as in that way and justify it in that way, you have a strong basis to recommend to a council for those councillors to make that decision. In the Com Games context, same sort of thing. The Com Games, in our view, and being a bit provocative here, the Com Games aren't about the Com Games. They'll be a spectacular 10-day party for a range of centres, particularly the Gold Coast, but other centres around Queensland. But in our view, they really should not be considered the be-all and end-all. They should be one of the events in the transformation of an economy, and transformation of a cultural economy in particular, over a long period of time.
And Darren, is there, in this process leading up to and beyond, the bringing in of these dynamics, the artists and other community leaders, is that a discussion that's started already with the council?
And so, to be transformational, you have to have a lot of cultural capacity development. So you have to develop cultural capacity along the way before an event like the Commonwealth Games, but have it to be sustainable afterwards. And in part, what I took from this morning's talk from Lindy was around the need to be able to create something which is actually worth investing in. And in doing so, you create something which attracts initial interest from government, but also then attracts corporate sponsors and potentially philanthropists, because what the product is worth associating with. And so I'm sure most arts workers would rather have more resources than less, and the way you do that is by creating a product which is, people will see as an investment and not as a cost, and willing to put more money in rather than less.
And that argument you might take to Judy, the councillor. How easy is that? And it can be quite a divisive difference between an executive management and a council. But Judy, I was going to throw over to you on some of your experience, but again, a quick snapshot of how these work in your region, these particular elements, but also how taking Darren's point, you might have a really good argument for it, how do you get the council across the line?
Thanks, John. While I appreciate that at the outset you said that all of these have to work together to achieve an outcome, I'm going to challenge that, because I know there's some community groups out there who work damn well without us lot interfering. They do.
This is a conversation where council does actively take the lead.
Okay.
It's not
okay. I just thought I would challenge that.
No, council doesn't have to be in everything, I can assure you.
Council doesn't have to be there.
But when you do, how are you going to do it?
When we do, we rock at it. Absolutely. As a councillor, and we all know, and Darren has sort of said about, we've planned to the eyeballs. We've got health plans and community plans and cultural plans and corporate plans, and we're that lot who sit up at the table and make all these plans. But can I actually say that the process of you approaching your arts work or the arts section of council or wherever, and then waiting for that process to go the right way up the channels, waiting for your CEO to bring it to the table. I have a really great CEO. I'm pretty sure he'd have to do some really good talking to get anything arty across the line at my table. So I guess the issue is that as an arts worker, as the arts department, as the executive assistant of any department, and me, the mayor, the CEO, absolutely every single one of us need to have ownership. The old, you need to know what you need to know, even though you don't need to know that you know it or whatever. Every single one of us need to take ownership of that. I need to know, through my portfolio of community and arts, what I need to know. Now, it might be just a conversation, and it might be an email, FYI, something. So that when I'm randomly having a conversation with Darren at Gold Coast, or Sue at Charters Towers, by the way, I've got a red hat I bought from there, never worn, but a great hat, thank you. Women in local government went to Charters Towers and we shop. But again, it's about ownership at every level. So council lives in silos. So I think I'm getting off the track. Council lives in silos, and I do. Council lives in silos, engineering and planning and community and all that kind of stuff. Don't you live in silos? Because you need to work with me, and we all need to know why your idea is a goer and how you need to network to actually make it happen. And I was saying to John earlier when we walked in, around council's tables, roads, rates, rubbish. I'm not a warm and fuzzy councillor, by the way, I do my best. I'm a roads, rates and rubbish councillor. But you know what? I'm a purpose, place, people counsellor as well. And the purpose I sit on my council is to help you, help me get what we want, the best for our community.
Thank you. And prior to being on council, you were active in that community as well, in terms around the arts. Were you an advocate for the arts before you became councillor?
No, actually, I come out of the shipping industry, and I was a shipping agent for the Board of Bundaberg, boarding and exporting and importing petroleum, sugar and molasses. Can I just say, again, perception. This conference is just wonderful. It's talked about perception, it's talked about language. If you want to talk the language of Brisbane and Sydney, in Quilpie or Charters Towers, they'll look at you with that glazed look, like some of my councillors do. You know, the language needs to be who you're talking to. At the same time, in meeting that arts worker, so what did you do before you got a real job is what's usually asked of me. And I love it because it's usually a bloke and you go, I was in shipping, mate, how about you? But again, find out about that person, find out what they actually bring to where they are today. And we've got some really great examples of huge success stories because we, and I use the royal we, I'm a bit passionate about my community. I want to find out all about you. When I work with you, we can bring about the best result.
And so your role as an arts advocate in the council, in some ways sounds like a lone voice. Did that develop when you got onto council and could see this, or how were you awakened to this notion that cultural development, arts development had something to offer within that community that your council should focus on?
I guess every single person who lives in my community is looking for, I usually use the word excellence, but an escape from reality maybe sometimes. Arts and culture, events, festivals, all those sort of things are family friendly. I have the lowest socio-economic region in my region, so it's not about the $150 going to opera. It's about giving purpose to my community to go out and celebrate who they are, where they are, with some amazing people who maybe we've funded to come in and do that celebration with us. And what's interesting to me is arts was kind of on the back burner because I have community development as well, and that's kind of they're warm and fuzzy as well. But when people in disaster, and Bundy has been hit fairly hard, the first thing everyone says is, what can we put on to get people together to tell them that we're all right and we're looking after them? So it's usually a cultural event, you know. So did I think that art and culture was important in my community when I put my hand up? Probably not, but what I did think was important was the voice of the people.
Okay, thanks. Let's go over to Thalep. A little bit of experience in the community. You've got to work with councillors. They're a very important part of the local governments. Your relationship there, and also with some of the artists, where you've been involved with projects where arts is at the centre of it.
As you alluded to earlier, John, I don't profess to be an artist. I come from a business background. I currently am the CEO for a health organisation. That's an Indigenous health organisation. It's well documented the link between art, culture, healing and well-being. So that's well documented. But from my experience working with artists, I was with state government for a short time before the cuts last year with the Newman government. For a short time with state government getting people into business, and particularly artists, they were gathering around me wanting to get into business, and saying to them, from a business point of view, limited market, what's your product? All these things, being a leader, is to review the landscape, try and soften the blow, but also support and teach them how to work the system. Because if you don't know the system, you can't go out there and put your case forward. And, you know, if you have a chance to either be in front of a council in a deputation, What are you going to say? Yeah, what are you going to say? If you don't have the training, or someone like me as a community leader prepare you for a deputation, first impressions count. So you go to a deputation, and you say you love it. Then the whole attitude of the councillors means, well, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they want. So why should we waste our time? As a community leader, if I could support the sector in preparing them for the possible pitfalls that they need to smooth out, who's the best person to represent them? There might be strong personalities within the group, but they might necessarily be the ones to go to the deputation, because they'll lose it, and then the council just wait. So it's about having the fine balance, and as a community leader, I hope I provide that sort of go-between where I can be that sounding board in that reality check.
Very, very succinctly put. So from our experience, leaders from the communities that aren't the artists, they're not on council, provide such a support. As long as they're introduced to the project, know the artist, and as part of the early conversation, not someone coming along later and saying, can we get 50 yards of timber to build something? It needs to be an early conversation. On that note, though, I'm going to throw to Rod, who's right in the middle of council project, artist community. Do you want to just bring back that loop and that relationship with the council management and also within the community and community leaders such as Thalep is talking about?
Yeah, I guess, and I just don't know where to start. I've been scribbling away here. Look, I think first and foremost we just need to I think it's fair to say that creativity is not in local government's DNA. Would that be fair? And I mean that in a respectful way. Local government's designed, it's there for a particular purpose. You know, local government serves a particular purpose. But creativity and the arts, I don't think, get a mention in the Local Government Act. You know, so I guess, you know, all of these bits and pieces coming together need to recognise what local government is there for, what's its role, and its role is there as a process-driven planning, you know, kind of regulator. So I suppose projects that I've been involved in that have worked the best is where a producer can come in after a cultural plan is done. When a council recognises already that arts and culture is important and puts that planning in place and gets that solidly around the table, and the thinking around the table, then a producer can come in and have a conversation. It's really, really very difficult to come into a situation where councillors haven't had that discussion and you're having the policy discussion at the same time as you're trying to get stuff done. It's really quite difficult. I'm just going to do a quick little role play. This is a benchmark, my benchmark of local government. The first time I ever did a deputation to local government, about 11, 12 years ago, I went out to far western New South Wales as a Regional Arts Development Officer. And as the new Rado in town, I sort of rocked up to one of the councils and was introducing myself, and you know, they were one of 7 funders of the organisation, and this is what I got. One elected representative sitting at the table reading the paper. I'm over here. Turned his back with the paper. Clearly, you know, the rural pages were far more interesting than anything I had to say, and they probably were. You know, and I just keep coming back to that. And that, you know, like whether that's happening quite so, it's never happened quite so overtly as that, I have to say, since. But, you know, this is often what we're dealing with. We're dealing with organisations and people who don't necessarily engage with the conversations that we're having. So a cultural plan, something that is adopted at a council table, is the thing, that is the conversation starter. And without it, it's really quite difficult. So, you know, like just in terms of, I mean, I totally agree with this structure. And I guess I would just suggest that perhaps it's not quite so so, the model feels a little bit linear, but there's got to be a connector. There's got to be somebody who can kind of have those conversations with all of those people. Sometimes that's a producer, sometimes it's the arts manager, sometimes it's an elected representative who's really passionate, sometimes it's a community leader who's making all of those connections and getting things started. So it can start in different places.
It can start, and the question, you need at least one, if not more, in each of those sections, so if one part is falling over.
Absolutely.
Like when you lose a council halfway through a project.
Yeah. Look, and can I also just say that I think that there's dare I use the word hierarchy, I think we need to. We need to recognise the power structures in this model, and that there is a hierarchy, there's a weighting of relationship. That because of its nature, because of the structure of the relationships, if a council says no, or if elected representatives don't engage, that's very, very difficult. It makes it very, very difficult to get anything of substance done in a community where you don't have people like Judy at the table advocating and pushing for things to happen. And it only takes one one voice to be really strong around a council table. But yeah, and I just think that there is a hierarchy in that as well.
There's a hierarchy, and this, as I said in one of the earlier slides, it needs the council plan. It doesn't have to say we're going to make lots of art. It just needs to leave the door open for people to say the solution to this is by employing an artist.
Yeah, I would say that a plan is a far more substantial and important document than a policy. You know, a cultural policy is all well and good. They can sit there and the council can tick it off and say, oh yes, we've done that, thank you very much. But what are you going to do about it? You know, what's next? What's the plan? And so the councils, you know, and I remember the days of the cultural plan in the Bundaberg and Burnett region, and, you know, that was really difficult to get over. Expensive, time-consuming and very difficult to get over the line at the time. But the minute that thing was adopted, and this was before amalgamation, both of those councils shared, you know, there was a shared arrangement between both councils, and they had agreed very strongly on the actions that were outlined. And those actions are still in place there. So, yeah.
And we are going to throw to some audience questions or particular points of view or comments or questions for the panel. Even short experiences relate to one of these relationships. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just give an example from the Generations project. Those 5 councils all started with what was the biggest thing on the council table. There was an issue. For one of the councils, when I met with the general manager, he said, look, in my constituency, they're not interested in any of the arts. They're not interested. I said, the top 10 things that we worry about, and the first one is youth truancy and kids mucking up. So, as it turned out, our project in that council area was dealing with young people, and many of them went from just about to leave school, being kicked out of school. One went on to become the school captain, another one went on to tertiary education, and they all completed to year 12. This was a group of kids. We didn't say to the council, oh, we know how to fix that. We just said, that's fine, we know what your issues are. Then we started working with the artists. We lost the council, so we only had the community leaders left to work with. And so you know the group I'm talking about. There was no council, we had community leaders, we had great artists, and we had a very good arts manager in that mix. And that project went like this, but by the time it finished, it reached the peak. So even though these things change, if people are aware of those dynamics and get it together, it does happen in the end. Arguing with councils over having an arts project rarely works. It's about what's the quality of life in your region, what's the livability, how does the arts play effect. You've died to say something, Judy. Say it before I open up.
I'm sorry. What I wanted to say was that, you know, arts does sit out here as, you know, that out in the black sort of somewhere. You as an arts worker, and maybe I didn't say this clear enough, have a responsibility to make sure every level of council knows what your project is. And I would challenge you to actually go and ask and make a friend of an elected member. I don't sit on my table alone. I do my homework with the knowledge that I've gained, because I can talk to the planning chair about how that art project is relevant for planning, urban design, engineering? Is it in a park? I've got environment. And bring all those people in. We had a doubter. He opened the recycling exhibition because he's waste and recycling councillor. Make it relevant and give them ownership to support the project that you're doing.
Question, Georgina. Did you want to make a comment, Sue, just while Georgina's getting the microphone?
Yeah, very quickly,
Just very quickly.
Very quickly, yeah, no, very quickly. I just actually wanted to support Darren's conversation. I mean, and Darren's role and my role in different languages, because we're dealing with different sectors and communication and things like that. So it's always interesting to hear somebody else articulate the same vision. And I just can't sell enough to the artists, or to the spectrum up there, that this is about an investment in your community. In our community, we have one of mining, cattle, education, tourism. So for me, arts is across all of those, but if I wanted to take one as an example, and this fell out of this project very loudly, was the cultural tourism. And for us, that was knowledge-based, and so knowledge, to have a knowledge-based economy which has an investment return, I need creative people in that, I need my artists. And we will develop our cultural tourism through the roof.
Thanks, Lou. Georgina.
It's a question for Councillor Peters and for Darren. I appreciate that every kind of scenario is different, so I wonder if we can kind of turn it on its head and ask, are there some common errors or things that you never ever want to hear from, whether it's officers or community members when they come to you to make an argument? Probably what I don't want to hear is you can't do it, they don't know what they're talking about. Because if you make that comment, you're as ignorant as maybe I am about your project. Let's sit down and have a conversation about what it is you actually need to achieve. And I'll tell you an example. Recently, and I've just been on the front page of the Bundaberg paper because I refused community grant to fix a driveway of the local successful Playhouse Theatre. They didn't fit the criteria. There's my planning council hat. They didn't fit the criteria. When I rang them and said, but you do a youth program out there, don't you? They said, yeah, we've got money for that. We just need money for the driveway. I said, no, you need funding for your arts project and then you'll have money for the driveway? No. So again, it's about having a conversation with someone, I guess, pointing out the obvious that you can't see, because there's more. Of course they could apply for the funding here for the program project and would have got it, but they said no, they were looking for this, which didn't fit the criteria. So I guess what I want to say is look at what you're doing, have a conversation with someone, again, that needs to know what you need to know so you can work through how you can get what you want.
Darren, what's the turn-off pitch?
I suppose people often come in very passionate about their projects, and you need to, if you are passionate about it, you need to know what the other person also thinks about and what they also need. So, I mean, the thing I don't like to hear is when someone comes and says, you know, this is all about me, and but enough about me, what do you think about me? And you need to be able to have that two-way communication. And
that doesn't happen with us.
So what I don't want to hear is no blank space where I can't put in what's required from a council perspective to make their project successful.
Other question? Yes.
Just a comment. That diagram seems to clearly state what is a formal process. I think that particularly in smaller communities, informal social networks can circumvent an awful lot of that. Often the spark for something can come from an artist, or it doesn't necessarily have to pass through that line.
No, it doesn't have to include the council at all, in fact. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So,
but I mean, it is possible for an artist to spark a CEO because they may know the
Correct,
city.
yeah. I think the relationships across are always there, but I think once the project's going, if you're going to... Those important relationships, the CEO, once it's going, needs to make sure the manager and the council have got what they need to deliver, and the information they need is really the point of this. Yep.
Look, I think the informal stuff is far more important than the formality. I mean, the formalities is the decision-making process. You know, I mean, all of the planning. If you haven't gone through that process of that informal conversation with the stakeholders, then there's no chance you're going to get the project done.
And that's right. These aren't hard fixed arrows. The sectors here are generally informal, but when you see something go wrong, it's when you find one of those relationships going wrong. Even in a smaller community, that can be seen to happen.
So, John, can I just say, what Thalep said before is so important, because you may have a passion for what you want, and it's about you, but you're not the deliverer. You do not know the talk. We're talking about language again that needs to happen around that council table. Governance and planning and all that stuff. You're just passionate about what you want. You really do need to send in the best person to support you to actually make your presentation, and you should have at least 2 people around that table who are going to, one, introduce you and what you're going to talk about. So an elected member, I introduce Thalep, who's representing, the XYZ organisation, and this is the project. I'm very supportive. We've had recent chats, and I think this project is really good. So in introducing him as an elected member, not just the CEO, I have actually added my weight to him, the person, and the group who are presenting whatever it is. So I will personally take on that ownership. If you walk in cold and none of us know who you are or what you're about to do, you pretty much, you'll get people who are thinking, when is it over and when's morning tea?
I'm reading the newspaper. We won't take any more questions because we do have a speaker following straight from the session. I just do want to wrap up with just a brief case study of the 11 projects we did. There was one that hit the mark in all those areas, which didn't mean the others failed. They all reached their certain ways, and I think so if we hadn't had an amalgamation in the middle of the project, we would have reached the end very well. But one that worked for us, and it's worth some analysis, and again there's information on our website, is the City of Greater Geelong. They had an issue that 10 years after amalgamation, the residents of Geelong were still surveying. They didn't see the City of Greater Geelong as their city. They saw themselves still in their own wards and weren't part of that greater group. The council made it a priority in their next term to address that culture and what it was about the City of Greater Geelong. One of its success indicators is that we don't know where it really started, because the CEO, the councillors, the community and the arts management were all in there. They'd all claim the success of it. But what it structured up was that the councillor, in a similar role to Judy's, was the portfolio councillor, pulled together with the CEO. The council did its plan and said, we want to fix this cultural issue. They put it into the CEO's key performance indicators that she has to solve this in 4 years. She then put it into her executive managers across the line, all of them, engineers, everything, not just the arts manager. The arts management was a particular skilled group of people who knew where to find the artists in the community and the community leaders. So you suddenly had all these bits working. So much so, their project was called Mouth to Mountain. It took 3 years to get together. It was the slowest of all the projects to get going because they spent time without knowing it, getting these things in place, and it was a really significant thing. Since then, the only people, there's one arts manager left, council's completely different, CEO's different, community leaders the same, but they're bringing back the same artists. They're going to do the project again, because the impact of that first one over 3 years called Mouth to Mountain, and it was a series of events that led up to a major event going from the Barwon River mouth through to the Yuyangs in a whole day. It had such resonance and memory within the community leadership that 3 years later they said, we want to do it again, even though the council had changed. The council had memory of that, they've been reinvested into it, and now they've decided to make that project part of the culture and the tradition of the City of Greater Geelong. and the design of on-song lines through each of those previously separate local government areas up to the Yuyangs. And it's now going to run 24 hours overnight as well. So it's something to watch, but it's, for us, in our observation, not every project reaches that, and you know why, because there's personalities, there's politics, people leave, people go, but when it does work, you get a huge flow on. I want to thank my panel that came together at short notice, to Sue for, first of all, agreeing to come to this conference to talk with me, because if I hadn't got Sue, I wasn't going to have a panel. And I want to thank Rod for certainly plugging me into the other panel members. It's been great to meet them over this time. And I think Gillian from Arts Queensland and Susan Hill helped find Darren in amongst the group. And thank you very much. And if you want to talk further about this kind of work, we're here for the day. Thank you.